So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome again to those who attended the dinner last night. I hope you had a good time in spite of the seriousness of the topic which we are going to deal with today. Human mobility, one of the big topics of our time. Before I hand over the floor to President Rød Larsen, let me just say a few words. We are living in an unprecedented age of migrations. Some facts were mentioned last night. 1 billion people are on the move. Only a fraction of those, as we all know, are recognized refugees under the Geneva Convention. The highest density of refugees and migrants is not, as many people think, in Europe, but in other parts of the world, countries like Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, and some sub-Saharan African countries. But let me say a few words about Europe, because it's simply the place I know best. What we have witnessed in Europe 2 years ago in 2015 was the biggest ever migration movement this continent has witnessed, except for the immediate aftermath of World War II. We had an all-time peak of 1.5 million illegal border crossings into the European Union, and that was thought to be about 10 times as much as the year before. Most of these people, around almost 90%, ended up in a small number of countries, one of which was Austria. Just to mention the figures, we had 900,000 people crossing Austria in the year 2015, and 90,000 of those stayed in Austria and asked for asylum. In 2016, the figures were much smaller, but they are still considerably higher than what they used to be before the year 2015. We have no chance of knowing how many people died in the Mediterranean, in the Sahara, or in some other difficult transit route. Now, what exactly started the wave? We do not know. Was it the Arab Spring and its consequences? Maybe the failed states which emerged? President Bush's wars? If so, which one? The war in Syria, whose refugees only make up for a small part of the refugee and migrant community we have here today. Was it climate change, natural disasters, man-made disasters, demography? As you know, at the beginning of the 19th century, the African population was about a quarter of the European population, and we expect in 2050 that this will be the reverse. Now, in all likelihood, it was a mixture of all these factors and many more. The situation is very complex, as you know. In many countries, we face serious economic problems and people just can't see a perspective for themselves. Often they are threatened, be it by local militia, be it by terrorists. Very often the reasons of today's movements are not what the Geneva Convention defined, individual persecution, but mass poverty, ecological disasters, and wars. And wars, as you know, are not really taken into account by the Geneva Convention either. And let us not get into the detail of how good the governance in the countries of origin is, because that would be the subject for yet another long seminar. We heard last night that the momentum of mass migration is unfortunately also being used by criminal freeriders of all kinds. Big, almost professional networks of organized crime, up to petty profiteers and the local mafias. They all are quite versatile. They know exactly about the gap in national legislations. They know how to use them, and they handle the social media better than most other people. A recent study of Europol and Interpol teaches us that today about 90% of migrants or refugees travel with some kind of help by people smugglers. We must not forget that in some regions of this planet, people literally live at different points in human history. And migration is a way of catching up. Migrants are essentially escaping from countries with dysfunctional societies. Unfortunately, they sometimes want to bring parts of these dysfunctional societies with them, which can cause problems where they arrive. Migration causes winners and losers, and the corresponding tensions. Migrations also produces diasporas, and diasporas produce migration. And as we know, diasporas are valuable for countries of origin because they send money back home, and very often these so-called remittances dwarf any other international financial flow. Today, I would like to say a few words about Europe. The present Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, as you know, used to be the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and in that capacity, he sometimes quoted George Orwell's Animal Farm, saying that some continents are more equal than others. And he said that about Europe, referring to the fact that in the European Union, we have only 7% of the world population, but we have 24% of world economic output and about 50% of international social services. We also have the equivalent of the equator as external borders, all of which accounts to the fact that Europe has become a kind of magnet for migrating people. But there very often is unfortunately a mismatch between incentives and expectations. We are told that those who migrate today are not necessarily the poorest in the countries where they come from. But once they arrive in countries of destination, they have, in most cases, given all their money to people smugglers. And what they find in Europe is societies which still haven't recovered entirely from what was the most serious economic crisis in post-World War times. The year 2015 showed us that even the legal tools we have did not always help that much. For example, the distinction between migrants and refugees wasn't actually the right tool in a way if you had to deal with numbers of people which were 5 or 6 digit. Experience showed we have mixed flows. People are not all refugees. Some are asylum seekers and hope to get refugee. Others are entitled to subsidiary protection, which means they're not refugees, but they can't be sent back home because it wouldn't be safe. Others are victims of human trafficking. Others are simply illegal migrants. It's not easy to tell the difference before you embark on a rather long investigation about every single cause. The European courts, both the one in Strasbourg on human rights as well as the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, take a long time to analyze individual cases, but they don't have a tool either against countries which simply don't respect the legislation and actually get away with it. Today, many European politicians would argue that the situation here is what we call under control, whatever that means. Having said that, we witness that there are very strong levels of migrants still coming along the so-called Central Mediterranean route. It's different groups of people from what we had in 2015. Many of these come from Africa, but some of them also come from the Middle East. And what we all know is that the root causes of migration and refugees hasn't gone away. There are no easy answers. What could the answers be? This is the topic for this seminar, but it is going to be very difficult. A few simple things people can agree on, like everybody agrees that we should try to control borders. We should try to stop smugglers, in particular with a view to stopping the deaths in the Mediterranean and on other difficult transit routes. We should also, most people agree, try to encourage people to return to their countries if it's possible and contribute to their countries there. But it is less easy to analyze some of the other solutions which are being proposed. We heard last night, and we usually hear very often, Western countries, prosperous countries should open legal pathways for refugees and migration. But in the political debate in these countries, it's a hen and egg situation. Because there, people would say, as long as we don't have control over our borders and what's going on, we will not open legal pathways. As long as we see people coming in illegally, why should we open legal pathways on top of it? Whereas the other countries would argue, if you had legal migration, people would not anymore risk such different and risky journeys to Europe. So that's one issue. Another issue is what can one do in countries of origin, in particular if the governance is such that you have to fear the money doesn't really arrive in the right place. And it's always very easy to teach people to see the bigger context. Media are not doing that. Giving you the entire complex picture of what's going on is too difficult for media. They rather focus on individual stories, on tragedies, or on nice stories, and sometimes on the fear of receiving societies which are also one subject that one has to deal with, because the receiving societies, which are not often mentioned in international documents, they somehow have to put up with the reality. They are the taxpayers who have to account for what is going on. And let me just mention one figure in this context here. In Austria, we have now, at the moment, about 80,000 persons who benefit from what we call basic assistance. They cost the Austrian taxpayer about €1,000 a month. The taxpayer doesn't know how long that will go on, and experience shows that it is not always easy to integrate migrants or refugees. Statistics say that it may well take 5 years before even half of those have found a job. So there are many questions to ask, and they're not necessarily unlegitimate either. The topic of what Austria does in the context of integration will be handled with this afternoon, so you will hear more about our efforts, but you will also hear probably that not all of these efforts always produce immediate results the way we would like it. I found a quote by Bernard Shaw, who once said, "Fear is like a magnifying glass." And this is also something you can find in both types of societies, both in countries of origin and in countries of destination. So it is not always easy. There is a lot of inconvenient truths which politicians don't like to tackle, but that might be something to tackle in a forum like this one. There are inconvenient truths for countries of origin having to do with their governance. There are inconvenient truths in countries of destination who now think that things are under control, but you can doubt that. There are inconvenient truths also for a lot of other actors. And some people say what we should actually discuss is whether somehow the traditional borderline between the first and the third world is starting to come down. Now that's a big subject. This seminar will probably not be able to give a full answer to it. Having said that, we are living in interesting times, and that is what the Chinese proverb actually advises against. But that's where we are. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I thought that was incredibly well spoken. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, good morning to you all, and once again, welcome to the 47th annual Vienna seminar. Today, it is an unfortunate, a very sad, and consequential fact that a combination of push and pull factors have resulted in approximately 243 million migrants worldwide. While most of these migrants have voluntarily moved in search of new and different opportunities, others have little or no choice but to leave. They've been pushed out of their own country, as we so dramatically heard from Rias when he spoke over dinner yesterday evening. In fact, war and persecution have driven more people from their homes than at any time since records began, with over 65 million men, women, and children now forcibly displaced worldwide. The global population of forcibly displaced people today is larger than the entire population of the United Kingdom. If there were a country, the forcibly displaced would be the 21st largest country in the world. And the numbers of forcibly displaced persons, both refugees and internally displaced, have increased dramatically in recent years. According to UNHCR, approximately 34,000 people were forcibly displaced from their homes per day in 2015, an average of 25 people per minute. This compares with six per minute in 2005. This unprecedented level of human mobility is a major challenge to the affected persons, many of whom take great risks to reach safety and security. but equally it is a challenge to the societies that receive them. All this is testing the limits of multilateral institutions designed to deal with various forms of displacement and migration. These were originally designed to deal with mobility at a much, much smaller scale and at a much, much slower pace than the massive flows of people we see today. Our first session of the day will therefore look at addressing root causes of displacement and migration in the new multilateral context. It will look at how agreed outcomes such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Security Council Resolution on Sustaining Peace can be useful, and I'll say be used, to prevent large movements of people forcibly or desperately fleeing their homes. Our second session will focus on challenges of coordination at the domestic and multilateral level, and will look at how states can work together to coordinate their actions for cross-border movements. In tackling this difficult challenge, it is also necessary and legitimate to also focus on the security concerns and societal needs of affected nations and regions. Our aim should be to ensure that policies and programs are people-centered, needs-based, and that they are inclusive. And for all those that are affected by the topics of the seminar today, that the migrants and also the peoples in the recipient countries and societies which are affected with societal and security implications. So that this is addressed also in a manner that is in full conformity with international human rights, humanitarian and refugee law. Then, our third session of the day will focus on the specific challenges related to internal displacement. And it is worth mentioning here that since 1990, the number of internally displaced persons has far outweighed the number of refugees. IDPs make up almost 70% of the over 65 million forcibly displaced people today. Yet, recent high-level discussions have been focused on refugees and migrants without actually addressing the particular challenges of internal displacement. This session will therefore look at effective strategies to ensure adequate protection and assistance for internally displaced persons and to prevent and to reduce such displacement. Our fourth and final session will look at strategies for integrating refugees, migrants, and internally displaced persons into their new communities. How can host countries successfully integrate refugees, migrants, and internally displaced populations, and taking advantage of the opportunities that arise by people being on the move? I've spoken several times about the importance of inclusion and taking into account not only the needs and concerns, but also the incredible potential of people on the move. We are therefore very pleased to count representatives of refugee, migrant, and internally displaced communities amongst us today, both as panelists and participants in all our working sessions, actually. So, ladies and gentlemen and dear friends, the annual Vienna seminar has been an institution of IPI for the past 47 years, as I mentioned yesterday, and in fact it has been held every single year since the establishment of the International Peace Institute in 1970. And this has been possible thanks to and I think I will use the word fantastic cooperation and partnership which we've had with the Ministry for Defense and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And so let me once again thank both our hosts today in this seminar, namely the Foreign Ministry, but also for our co-organizer and co-partner, the Ministry for Defense, for hosting us today, and for the partnership over the years. So Elizabeth, thank you very much for all that as well. Thank you.
We'll move right into session one so the panelists can come up. Before we begin session one, just one moment, one point of housekeeping. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President. One moment of housekeeping. This session, for session one, will be live streamed. The following sessions after this will be held under Chatham House rules. So if you are tweeting, if you are participating in social media, now is a good time. Terje Rod-Larsen will be the chair of this session, but first we'll have an introductory presentation by Snezhana Samarchik-Markovic, who I had the pleasure of meeting yesterday and I already consider a friend. Snezhana is, since 2012, the Director General of Democracy at the Council of Europe, in charge of the organization's action promoting democratic innovation, governance, participation, and diversity. Previously, she held numerous positions in the Serbian government, including Assistant Minister of Defense and Minister of Youth and Sports. Snezhana, please, welcome.
Shall I sit at the...
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. First and foremost, good morning, Your Excellency Director General T.G. Filsberg and President Rod-Larsen, and good morning, dear participants. First, I would like to thank the organizers, IPI, but also the Ministry of European Integration and Foreign Affairs, as well as the Ministry of Defense and Sport, for hosting this seminar and inviting me, or rather Council of Europe, to the first session of the seminar. And I could only say that this is a particularly ambitious and forward-looking session, trying to place the migration challenges in a global context in a longer-term perspective. And this longer-term perspective, in my opinion, is a very, very welcome approach. Why? Because all too often nowadays, the question of displacement and immigration is reflected as emergency, as a crisis. And there are many, of course, justified reasons for that crisis mode. But there might be not only justified reasons, there might be a lot of consequences. And the consequences do not have to be very good. So the approach of this seminar leads us to reflect a truly long-term perspective, how strategies are shaped and how migration can not only be handled, which we feel is the case for the moment, but how can they be managed. Then, in that case, if they are managed, the consequences might be slightly more predictable, might be slightly more better for all, for individuals, for states, and I would also say for multilateralism. And today, my focus will be a bit European, and I have to apologize for that first and foremost. The second, from that European perspective, I'll try to tell you what is it that we see, what is it that we do, and what we see as a possibility or might be a possibility how to go about the situation. Well, the first a bit about the organization I represent. This is the Council of Europe. It's the regional European organization, and our three main values are human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And our jewel in the crown, and you don't have to know that, our jewel in the crown is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and the basic standard for our work is the European Convention for Human Rights. It's the standard for all European countries, EU and non-EU countries alike. And all people in Europe which we count to be approximately 800 million people, they are covered by this convention. And this gives the Council of Europe a very special role, and I would say also a special responsibility in upholding the standards of human rights, and especially in the times of crisis, like we are today. A bit about our membership is larger, as I said, than the European Union. It covers 47 European states and practically the whole Europe except Belarus. As such, for us, the migration issues arising from this geographic scope also go well beyond those of the European Union. And for us, in general, our member states are both countries of origin, transit, and arrival of migrants and refugees. So what do we see from this pan-European perspective? As noted by our Secretary General in his report, it's a report, annual report on the human rights, democracy, and rule of law in Europe. He or we as an organization, we see that managing mass migration while respecting human rights obligation is proving to be a major challenge. There are international commitments, particularly in the human rights field, where our member state undertook to respect over the years as regard migration. And I'll name few. For instance, in addition to the European Convention on Human Rights that I mentioned, we have developed standards by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, the Convention Against Trafficking in Human Beings, Istanbul Convention, that is against violence against women, Lanzarote Convention, that is against violence against children, and even the Lisbon Convention, which I will come back later on. In short, there are very many standards. They are legally binding, and we monitor their implementation. And through the monitoring, we then, with the results of the monitoring, compile the Secretary General report. So what do we see in reality? In many instances, migrants, and particularly irregularly present migrants, have had their basic rights denied or curtailed. Some member states have closed their borders with refugee-generating countries. Some have responded by resorting to the wide use of administrative detention. Some praiseworthy efforts have been made in some of our member states to provide migrants amassed in border areas of cities with proper accommodation. But living conditions in many official camps remain below standard. Perhaps the worst of all are also grave concerns about the treatment of the high number of unaccompanied minors. Many refugee and migrant children receive no adequate education or no education at all. Many are at risk of trafficking, abuse, and exploitation. And when we speak about crisis mode consequences, especially bad ones, the situation of these minors has potential to grow into a big challenge for democracy, rule of law, and human rights in future in Europe. But let us stay still with the Secretary General report. It notes that the above findings are only aggravated by their interaction with another crucial and very important development. With great concern, we see that in a growing number of countries, nationalist and xenophobic parties are making gains by challenging elites and exploiting public anxieties over migration. Interpreting the reports and pictures from European borders, not as seeing large groups of individuals suffering for a long time, but actually picture everything as invasion. Established politicians then are responding by toughening up their stances on issues such as asylum and law and order, because they need to do something, and they need to do it now. And hereby, they are fueling intolerance and damaging community relations with Muslims, Muslim communities often suffering most. And in this crisis and emergencies, the international standards and commitments do not seem to be important priority. Or should I say, and sometimes, they can be seen as unwelcome. And we also read the statement of a prime minister of a European country that called the European Court of Human Rights a threat to the security. The Council of Europe is therefore also very concerned about governments openly challenging and disregarding their international commitments. I didn't say obligations now, I'm speaking about commitments, to uphold human rights, and more generally about international organizations being stigmatized in the name of nationalism. International organizations are accused of depriving individual states and their people of sovereignty. The role of internationalism is in advancing agendas on the way of more democracy, more human rights, and more rule of law is simply denied or voluntarily ignored. So this is what the report says. I mean, it states probably the obvious. But what do we do? At the Council of Europe, we strongly believe that managing diversity is an opportunity for our societies. And this has led, notably, to the adoption of a thematic plan on building inclusive societies, which has a strong migration-related dimension, and also it has led to ongoing elaboration of another action plan on migrant and refugee children. And these action plans are also confirmed by our member states. So don't get me wrong when we picture the situation in member states. They do try as well, and do try also to do something about activities on international multilateral level. And let me illustrate what activities do I have in mind when it comes to these action plans. One of them is ECRI, General Policy Recommendations on combating hate speech and on protecting irregularly present migrants from discrimination. What is ECRI? ECRI is the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, a monitoring body of Council of Europe, and it is composed of experts. And they recommend, for example, in one of these recommendations, they recommend that the member states do not use doctors, for example, to register migrants, because it could be seen in a wrong way. And they even thought about other measures. Then a recommendation on the implementation and provisions of the Lisbon Recognition Convention on recognition of qualification of migrants. Lisbon Convention is about education. It has provisions for mobility of students and teachers in Europe. But also it has a provision, article number 16, about the qualification of migrants. Because what we do, and this was said also yesterday, we don't want migrants, whether they stay or they go back, we don't want them to hate Europe. We don't want them to lose their qualifications obtained regularly before. And what we try to do is to make something, we are piloting something now called passport for qualifications. Meaning if a refugee could get the qualifications recognized in Greece, and he or she moves later on to other parts of Europe, there is no need to go again through the whole process of recognition of qualifications. And why is it important? In a way, it spares funds from member states, it doesn't duplicate the work, and above all, it gives an important signal to refugees. You are people we appreciate. We appreciate your qualifications, academic qualifications. Then we have ad hoc monitoring procedures on the application of Anti-Trafficking Convention and on the Lanzarote Convention against sexual exploitation of children and others. What is important there? For example, for Lanzarote. It's important that we help our member states to bring a European standard how to recognize age assessment of the minors. It's a tricky issue, also guardianship, etc. But I will only place one more important example to your attention, namely our attention given to the cities. Very often they are in the front line when it comes to both receiving and integrating refugees and migrants. And the Council of Europe has created an important group of cities, network. They are called the intercultural cities, where we have more than 120 to date. And they are all engaged in intercultural integration. What is the simple philosophy of our intercultural cities? Instead of fearing how to share our already small cake with refugees, the philosophy of intercultural cities is, why don't we make together a cake bigger? So their policies are based on the fundamental assumption that the newcomers and the diversity they bring along are an asset rather than a burden. Vienna is not a part of intercultural cities, but they do the type of work, and that's most important. So the cities I mentioned do sometimes experience tensions with the national migration policies, as the national concerns might sometimes fear tension with the international commitments. But we are not here to build on tensions. They are good news. And I think with the adoption of the UN 2030 agenda, migration has been fully integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals and targets, thus giving us also a longer-term span to look at it. The declaration of the 2030 agenda recognizes the multidimensional reality of migration and its contribution to inclusive growth, and at the same time recognizing the vulnerability of migrants, refugees, and IDPs. We can count at least 10 of the 169 targets referring to issues related to migration and mobility, from the most specific 10.7, facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration, to a number of targets which are implicitly related to migration, such as education, as I mentioned, ending human trafficking, respecting labor rights of migrants, workers, etc. And so we believe that most, if not all, of the Council of Europe activities are relevant and contribute to the implementation of the Agenda 2030. Now, for conclusions. It is, I think, a common view that there is a need to act in countries of origin of migration flows to build resilience, increase stability, and enhance development in order to reduce further mass migration. In our European yard, it is very important to curtail the business of smugglers. Council of Europe coordinates, especially in the field of trafficking of human beings, with OSCE and EU. And no one disagrees that it should be possible over the long term, as the seminar will try to generate a reduction in migration flows by supporting economic development, good governance, etc. Many countries, and also the European Union, have already unlocked funds to this effect. But are we doing enough in terms, for instance, of coordination of efforts? In a context of limited resources, where should we draw the line between investing, on one hand, facilitating integration of newcomers, as I presented in Council of Europe, or on addressing the root causes of migration to ultimately reduce the flows? Many things, as we know, are unpredictable. But we can, with relative safety, predict that migrations in their different forms will not simply stop or suddenly disappear from the agenda. Therefore, I'm looking forward to participate in this seminar and to listen and to learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Snezana. I thought that was terrific. And I'm actually so tempted to tell the audience here that there's something else with you which I, as a Norwegian, find terrific. And that is that she actually speaks flawless, fluent, and very rich Norwegian.
Tack ska du ha.
Even better than your very good English. But we will now turn to our panel discussion. And as we've heard, there are many reasons why people are on the move. And of course, mobility has been a feature of human history since its very beginning. And I'd also like to underline once again that societies around the world have benefited from migration for many, many centuries of various reasons. But as we also heard about yesterday, some people do actually not choose to move, they are forced to move. And as pointed out, there are more displaced people who are pushed and not pulled than at any time since World War II. And in order to respond to this challenge, we have to understand the causes of displacement. And we have to ask ourselves about the context, how we can formulate responses at the national level, at the regional level, and at an international level. We have to discuss what are the tools to be employed in order to address the causes, the reasons for the increase in refugee flows and international displacement. And I think we now have an absolutely excellent panel to address these issues. We have Riaz Aljundi, I hope I pronounced it correctly, who is a human rights consultant. Some of us listened to him also yesterday, but I think since there are several people here who were not present at our dinner yesterday, I should say a few words about you as well. So Riaz has 20 years of experience working on the Middle East and North Africa, and has recently been volunteering with refugees in Greece, as we heard also about yesterday night. And then we have on my left-hand side, I'm going to hope I pronounced the name correctly, Jagan Chapagin, yeah. Okay. Who is Chief of Staff and Director in the Office of the Secretary General in the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies. And then on my very left, we have Yusuf Mahmoud, who is a colleague of mine. He's the Senior Advisor at the International Peace Institute in New York. And he is also the former Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations in the Central African Republic and in Chad. So, and I'd also like again to welcome you, Snezana, to the panel. So, Riaz, the floor is yours for your comments. And I give all of you 5 minutes, and then we have a discussion, and then open the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you again, and good to see the new people who came today. As our friend mentioned here, I mean, immigration and migration is as old as the beginning of the modern history. If we take the Middle East and North Africa, it's always on the move in one way or another. If we take particularly Syria, the Syrians have been moving for improving their lives since the beginning of the 19th centuries. We have a huge number of Syrians in Latin America. The biggest Syrian community is in Brazil, where the Syrians moved there when the Latin America started establishing itself. Including my grandfather, who lived in Argentina for 21 years to have better life. Moving has two aspects. Either you choose to move because you want to improve your life, or what we are witnessing nowadays, you are forced to move. And this is both from my experience as well. I moved out of Syria or I was made to move as well. It is very difficult for the majority of people. I was lucky I spoke English. I went to an English-speaking country, but I have been working also with displaced people, and it is very difficult when you are forced to move. There are, in the Middle East and North Africa, there are too many reasons for being forced to move. The region is very rich region economically, but it's very poor region politically, and when it comes to human rights. The social and economic rights in the Middle East is very poor, and it's dead in the majority of the Middle East. And since the Second World War, so many Middle Eastern countries took what supposed to be independence, but it wasn't independence. Because for example, take Syria. The French were too nice to us. They left Syria after 26 years of occupation, after the first from 1920 to 1926. Since 1946, sorry. Since then, we have absolute unstable political situation. One military coup after the other. We had like 2 periods of really nice democracy in the 50s, and then 1954, we have one coup after the other, until the Ba'ath Party took over in 1963, and we have absolutely miserable life. This is Syria, where it's a bit advanced, more advanced than other countries. But if you take the resources we have in the Middle East, the petrol in the Gulf region, Libya and Iraq, we don't use these resources for ourselves. We don't use that to develop, for development reasons, for people can feel settled in their country. I have to tell you something. So when I lived in Syria, I never felt that Syria is my country. I felt refugee in Syria. This is my true feeling. While after maybe 3 months, I felt the United Kingdom is my home, and I still feel that. This is an example to show you that people are not welcomed in their countries. Everything goes to the rulers, and the rulers are connected with external forces. The economic and social rights are very important for settlements in your own country, and we don't have them. Freedom of expression is dead in the vast majority of the Middle East. If you take the current situation, if you take Tunisia out of the Middle East, which has some little hope, the others, you might be killed, disappeared, or internally displaced or displaced externally for saying a little criticism. The social relation, the intersocial relations in the Middle East is also dead. The rulers or the dictators, I can say that on personal capacity, they created the chaos within the country. Then there is no coherence within the social layers in the society, so they create chaos, infighting, and the rulers stay. And then we have the external issue, like what happened in the most obvious 2 examples of Syria and Iraq under Saddam Hussein and Assad the father, that the most Western powers, you witness that, they supported the dictators under the pretext or the reason of stability. But when the stability was a bit shaken, and we are witnessing what is happening in Syria now. Millions of guns around all over the place. And the violence, just because we were all oppressed in a little bottle. It's like a Coca-Cola bottle in Syria. I just always say that. We shake it for 40 years, and then we opened it, and we all erupted like a volcano. This instability, no political rights, no social rights, it is accumulated through the last decade, a few decades, until we have the wars. We have the glimpse of hope in the Arab Spring, like, okay, we will be able to change. We will have democracy, we will have rights. But then also, when you deny people for 45 years or 50 years of their rights, it's not easy to go on the ladder peacefully. Now the wars in the region, the obvious wars like Syria, Iraq, Libya, and others, and the smaller wars, the stability, Bahrain, it's now, unfortunately, the direct reason of mobility. I have been, as I said yesterday, volunteering in Greece for the last year and a half, like on and off. And people in general, nobody wants to leave. It's not easy to leave, and the dream of improving your life, it can be fulfilled in your own country. But when you are forced, you want to look for a place where you can feel your future. The biggest theme I have concluded during my contact with tens of thousands of Syrians in Greece, the biggest theme was, I'm looking for a future. The main reason now for leaving the Middle East, or for being made or forced to leave, there is no future. For you, for your children, or for your grandchildren. This is why we saw in 2015 and 2016, and we are still witnessing people crossing to Greece, despite the situation, despite my own work explaining how bad the situation is in Greece nowadays, and people are still crossing. This enforcement, it's not 1 week old or since 2011. I left Syria in 1998 because I was a journalist, and I wrote a little article, satirical one, said, thank God we have human rights. And I paid high price for it. Imprisonment or torture, and at the end I was able to flee. For little article. And you can take the measures of this little satirical for a reason why the Middle East and North Africa, this very rich region, why they are moving. And we have to tackle that to look into the roots, how we can stop these issues in the Middle East, the wars, and how can we stop supporting people who are abusing people's rights to be able to tackle the theme of migration or immigration in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Riaz. Been there, seen it, and painfully experienced it.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing your passion and your compassion with us. May I then move to you, Dagan, to hear your perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you to IPI and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense for this invitation. I I feel really privileged and honored to be here in this important seminar. When Tere introduced me as the Chief of Staff in Geneva, but more than 20 of my 25 years of career have been in the field. I have worked in the field. And my first job was in Nepal, working with the refugees from Bhutan. About 90,000 Bhutanese refugees were living in eastern Nepal, and that was my first professional job. So I have been closely associated with the refugee situation. Also, I come from Nepal, and Nepal has been a host of Tibetan refugees. I don't think many people even talk about it. I don't think you even hear that there have been thousands of Tibetan refugees living in Nepal since 50s. One of the poorest countries on the earth, hosting thousands of refugees. Do you hear any problem? Do you hear any issue? Is it a political issue? No. Is it an economic issue? No. If a country like Nepal can do that, I think many other countries should be able to do it. And actually, of course, I was born much later, and we have seen the contribution of the Tibetan refugees in the culture of the country, especially on the food. One of the best food you can get in Kathmandu are heavily influenced by the Tibetan refugees, settled in Kathmandu, and in many other cities in the world. This is just to give you as a way of background. I think that the issue, I had a prepared text, but I decided not to use it because so much has already been said. Because this is probably one of the issues in last few years, most researched about, most talked about, most seminared about. So I think there is so much information. So whatever I'm going to share with you today, I don't think it's going to be anything new. So I'm telling you already beforehand, not to disappoint you, that I don't think you will hear anything new that you haven't heard already before. Let me start by saying I came across a quote from a Canadian journalist, Harsha Walia. She said, "Butterflies have always had wings and people have always had legs." And I think you mentioned before, the people have been moving around, always. The world of today is the way it is because people have always moved around. If the people have always moved around and the civilization have developed because of the movement of the people, why suddenly in last 2 to 3 years this has become such a big issue? 65 million, 240 million. Honestly, I don't even now try to remember the numbers because these are just the numbers. They keep on changing. Why it has become such a big issue? Because, one of my explanation is people always refer to this number and make a reference to Second World War. People say, we haven't seen this number since Second World War. We haven't seen this type of pain since Second World War. There is always a reference to Second World War. We are not in the World War now. We are not in the middle of Third World War. There is no World War. There are many, many wars, but not a World War. Why we have this scale and intensity and the speed of movement of the people? And I think that's new. The movement of people is not new. The immigration is not illegal. People have always moved. But the scale and intensity, that's been new. The second thing, this has been also new, is, the 86% of the people that are on the move don't come to Europe. They live outside of Europe. It has become such a big issue because in the last 2 to 3 years, the number of people that have moved to Europe has suddenly increased. And many European governments have suddenly realized the pain of suddenly having to accept this number of people and what it means to manage that. I think this has led to this significant awareness, significant discussion, and a push to do something about it. I think the main topic given was, what are the root causes? And I think there are many, many causes. But one thing I came across when I was studying, I think it was a Norwegian professor who came up with the theory of a model of what is called the center-periphery model. When we look at the history of how the countries have developed or the societies have developed, there have been centers within the countries, the capitals, the big cities, which have everything. They have good schools, good education, the elite lives there, the government seats are there, major institutions are there, and there are peripheries. And in some cases, probably those peripheries were designed to be peripheries, and that's what the professor says. But in some cases, that's probably what happens automatically. So we have created in the history the centers which are well off, and these are peripheries which are needed because the center needs cheap labors, center need places where they can go and produce cheap, and centers need all these things to ensure that the center can continue to thrive. And this model can explain the wars we are seeing. A lot of the wars come because of the periphery and the centers, the gap, the disparity between the center and the peripheries. Sometimes we say, war is a cause for migration. Yes, but war is caused by something else. So when we talk about the root cause, we need to see what is causing war. The disasters and crises are caused for migration, but not by themselves why disasters are being caused. There are reasons there. There are issues, a lot of social, economic, political issues, the good governance issues, the investment on the social infrastructure issues. That not happening, and by creating that centers and the periphery within the country, but also between the countries. I believe that has contributed this massive disparity, and that disparity sort of leading to this crisis, disasters, inequality, and people's desire for safety and security. I think you can never take that away from people. People will always look for safety and security. They will be always looking for well-being, and if they see an opportunity to get a better well-being, they will do that, and people will always be looking for dignity for themselves and for their families. I think we heard a compelling story from you yesterday. I don't think if you were not losing your dignity, you would have left that country. You left that country because you were sick for your dignity and your family's dignity. So I think if we don't look into the much deeper issues of the migration, we will not address the cause just by looking into the wars or climate change or the disasters. There are much deep-rooted issues, and I hope going forward in the conversation, we will have opportunity to look a bit deeper into that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Insight through learning by doing. Then the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you. I'm relieved and happy to be the last speaker. I've been slashing away all my... so my task is basically share with you the main elements that need to be taken into account when you develop a prevention strategy. But before that, I just want to remind you of some of these, the context behind these elements. Let me start with one paragraph of a poem by a Somali-Kenyan poet, Warsan Shire. In her poem, Home, she writes, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. No one would leave home unless home chased you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." What Shires is trying to say is that displacement is an act of desperation. Many of those who leave feel like jumping from a high up without a parachute. If you need to know more, take a look at their stories in multiple languages on the I Am Migrant website sponsored by the International Organization for Migration. The factors that drive and sustain forced displacement, as you have heard, are many and varied and are known. They tend to be the result of a constellation of fault lines of governance and development deficits, some of which exacerbated by climate change. Of course, we should address these factors, but let us be clear on principle. We should do so because no one should have to live in distress. And when we do respond, it is often under the tyranny of the urgent, where temporary relief is sought through quick fixes. And I don't have time to review these quick fixes. To be clear, humanitarian action is essential to meet urgent needs. But in doing so, we must not lose sight of the context in which these problems arise. By focusing exclusively on forced displacement as a phenomenon, we tend to ignore, as we have heard, the persons, the policies past and present, as well as the politics that drive and sustain this phenomenon. Displacement is nonviolent self-protection strategy, those fleeing armed conflict are making a choice not to participate in violence or to be victimized by it. And they do so at great cost to themselves and their families. Nor do all those who remain in areas of ongoing conflict participate in violence. Most do not. I have plenty of statistics to support that. We don't have the time. Those who stay, youth and women in particular, develop creative, survivalist, coping responses to avoid, mitigate, or contain violence. And if we are serious about prevention, we must strengthen the will and capacity of those who continue to resist desperation and violence, even in the direst circumstances. OCHA and UNHCR estimate the average duration of displacement now stands at 17 years. 17 years, long enough for a child entering primary school to finish college if their education is not interrupted. The ideal, of course, is to facilitate return of these displaced persons to their homes as swiftly as possible. The reality, however, is that displacement tends to be protracted. And over this protracted period, the displaced acquire other identities that they may have developed over their long years of displacement. They can be doctors, teachers, bakers, some of them poets. Just look at that website. They can contribute to peace and development wherever they may be, and therefore help address some of the underlying push factors we've talked about. Those who return to their former homes, so we've talked about those who stayed, those who left, and those who return, and this is what I'm going to focus on quickly. Those who return to their former homes cannot be neglected either. The situation to which they may return may have changed significantly in their absence. Here too we can ask, how can we support them in responding to such changes? Cities, also as we have heard around the world, are becoming the front line of the challenges created by human mobility, forced or voluntary. How can we empower urban authorities and residents to respond to these challenges? At IPI, to take into account all these elements, we have tried, through our research and convening, to look at this global phenomena of mass migration through a sustaining peace lens. A lens that has been inspired by the recently adopted UN resolutions on enhancing UN responses to contemporary challenges to peace, security, and development, of which mass migration is only one of them. The sustaining peace approach is motivated by the humility to learn from what still works well in societies in distress, and to respect that every individual has capacities and assets, not just needs and vulnerabilities. This is true, of course, of the forcibly displaced and of the great majority of those who choose to remain behind. Under the sustainable peace lens, development solutions are an integral part of any prevention strategy of mass migration, since inclusion and peace are both an outcome and an enabler of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as we have heard. So in light of the above, what would a prevention strategy of mass migration would look like from a sustaining peace perspective? 1, analysis of the context at all levels, global, national, local, to uncover not only the factors that drive and sustain displacement, but also to identify the positive, resilient capacities of people, those who leave and those who stay behind and those in transit. This mapping must include city mayors. Second, a dispassionate review of ongoing and past responses in order to draw the appropriate lessons and to avoid perfecting the same errors. 3, and last, design global strategy that do not only address urgent needs, but also strengthen those resilient capacities for peace and ensure that development, governance, and security responses leave no one behind and are pursued in a holistic manner that do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youssef, for your prose and for your poetry. It was very powerful, so thank you again. I can see we have 45 minutes left, so let me just reflect a little bit on what I've heard, not only in the panel, but also in discussions yesterday. Before I open the floor, I'm sure there will be many questions to the very interesting panel we have with a broad range of experiences and also a bit different perspectives. So what I think I've heard is a description of the issues at hand. And I think there's a fairly broad consensus on what the picture is. I think nobody disputes the basic statistics. We can discuss if what happened after World War II is the most relevant way of looking at it, but the picture is clear, and I think everybody sees it. So in many, many issues of a social, economic, and security character, there are huge disputes about what are the facts, and there are different images of reality. So the good news here is that I think there is a common image of reality. But then, so this is the descriptive aspect of it. But then we come to the prescriptive aspect of it. And here, and I might be a little bit brutal here, I think I hear more wishful thinking than I see a roadmap on how to move. So this is my second observation. My third observation is that based on the different discussions I've had also yesterday in particular, what I hear is that, or what I see when one is talking about causes and what to do about it, I see silos. I see one community who basically is saying we should only talk about the interest of the refugees and not to talk about the societal consequences in the country which are recipient, and particularly not about the security consequences. And I also see that there is another silo which basically says, look at the political consequences of, and now I'm thinking about Europe, look at the political consequences of the flow of refugees. And regardless of what the realities is, because there is a perception amongst huge segments of the population in every single country in Europe that this is a threat to their way of living. It might not be true that it is a threat, but the perception is there. And this has been driving a kind of return of ideology to Europe, where there are striking parallels to what we saw in the mid-war period, both in left-wing movements and in right-wing movements, and particularly, I think lately, the last, though there are similarities between the approaches both on the left and the right. And my opinion is that we should not be opinionated about this. We have to look at all of this because it's interlinked. And there are legitimate grievances here related to all of these issues, along the migration issue, along the security issue, among the societal issue, and the political issue. How do one approach this? I think there is a consensus that we're talking about the root causes. Is that, and again I will use Europe as an example, that when we see the flow of refugees coming from various countries outside Europe to Europe, I think one cause, and all of you have talked about it, is bad governance. regimes where there's no transparency, no accountability, which are extremely authoritarian or outright-totalitarian, where there's repression, etc. That's one cause. And then there is a second cause, which is demography, which is, and there were several examples. Elizabeth mentioned examples this morning. Let me mention another example, which I always use. If you look at the population of Egypt today, it's 80, 90 million. In 2050, it will be the double. And that country, with the institutional arrangements you have today, it's impossible for it to sustain such a population. So what will they do? They will move.
Yeah.
So we have if we look at it, what we are seeing today is just a tiny little fraction of the problem which we will have in 10, 20, 30 years from now. Is it addressed? No. My opinion is here, and I alluded to it yesterday, is that if you look at that particular region, and since I know it pretty well, I'm using that as an example. I mean, it's lack of institutional structures and also lack of regional cooperation, which is another main reason, cause, why we are having this problem. And so, seen from a European perspective, what is the answer then? To me, the answer is that what we should do, Europeans, is to assist the countries in the region in a sensible way in order to create those structures. And then you can do it, you can approach this in two ways. You can push, you can go in with sanctions, you can go in with name and shame, you can use military force. I mean, this is one approach. The other one is a pull approach, where you give positive incentives to move in the right direction. And here I would pay the European Union and the Council of Europe a big compliment. Because after the demise of the Soviet Union and the old Eastern Europe, what the European Union in particular did then was basically saying, you will get strong economic incentives, but you have to qualify. You have to have freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, you have to have good governance, you have to have parliamentary democracies, etc. If you do that, there will be huge rewards. And one of the reasons why, by and large, this has gone very well is because there were positive incentives. Nobody were forced to do anything. There were incentives to move. So it was not a push approach, it was a pull approach. And I think, one has to rethink the use of development money in a fundamentally new way in the Western countries, and think about creating pull systems of pull incentives for a better cooperation. Because if you look at the broader and longer perspective, this can only be resolved in the regions. But it can also only be resolved by a cooperation with Europe and other first world countries. So this is my perspective. Actually, I always insist that the moderator shall not take, you see, my IPI colleagues is looking at me because I was always telling them, you are not a part of the panel when you moderate, you moderate. So I've done exactly the opposite. So I have to apologize to my staff. Anyhow, may I open the floor, please?
Can I add something on what
Absolutely. I mean, you can take the floor at any point of time you want.
Maybe while the questions come, I wanted to add, and I fully agree with you on some of the things you said on investing on the governments, the good governance and things like that. Of course, I come from Red Cross. The important thing also is investing on the communities. Generally, what happens, what we have seen in the world is in the countries where there is a weak or ineffective central governance, that's when the civil society organizations and communities are more active. That's, you see more and more of that. I think so. While we invest on the central governance, improving central governance, the infrastructure systems and policies and procedures, we also need to really invest at the community level, because the resilience is built at the community level. And those resilience building approaches should be holistic and comprehensive, as you mentioned. And I think, the last year in the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a commitment made that through the grand bargain that there will be an increased investment on the localizations and putting those type of resources, especially in the countries where the governance at the central level is not good or effective. I think we should really emphasize that point, that until and unless we invest in the communities at the local level, at the local governance level, we are not going to make a lot of difference. So these billions that Europe spends would go on the sand pits, especially in those countries. So I just wanted to compliment on what you said.
Thank you very much. So I can see there are a few hands, so when I give you the floor, can you please say your name and your affiliation? So I will start on the gentleman on the first bench here. Ambassador Frösnäs, I believe. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that the moderator gave in to his genetic temptation to make a substantial comment, because I think what you said was very pertinent, namely that Europe can indeed help in presenting factors that may be seen as a pull factor. And I can give you an example from my own career. I was for many years EU ambassador of the Council of Europe in Brussels, and also during the first years of the Arab Spring. When the revolt had started in Tunisia and it spread also to Egypt, I was approached by ambassadors from the whole string of countries in the North Mediterranean, from, Palestine authorities, Jordan, Egypt, not Libya, but Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. And they all came to learn more about the system of conventions built up through the 50 years of Council of Europe, to protect democracy, to uphold human rights, and to introduce and strengthen the rule of law. And we started a cooperation whereby the Council of Europe offered practical advice on how to build up such a society that they saw as a role model. Well, this process is not finished, to put it mildly, but it's interesting that it started. And that is the kind of expertise, of best practice, which can be put at the disposal of countries that lack these institutions and this institutional history. And I should add also that I was approached in a similar way by the Central Asian countries, stretching all the way out to Mongolia. And we sent their ambassadors on missions to Strasbourg to learn more. These are processes that are not very visible in the media of today. They are not as strong as we should wish, but they are there, and the potential remains considerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will now move to the lady who's on my right side here. Please state your name and affiliation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm Kathleen Samuel with the U.S. mission to the OSCE, and I was struck by many of the comments today. And
I think you should lift the microphone a little bit higher.
I hope this is better. Kathleen Samuel from the U.S. mission to the OSCE, and I was struck by much of the dialogue today in the need to rethink development aid, as you very succinctly put it. So I'd like to ask just a rather question to stimulate discussion. Do we need something similar to a modern Marshall Aid Plan for regions of origin for migration to help rebuild countries, to help build those democratic institutions, to help address some of the problems that some of the speakers were talking about? Related to that then, how do we encourage other countries that are providing development aid or investment assistance to these countries to adhere to the values, to create those pull factors that are necessary? And how do you convince the governments in question that they need to do that. As someone who's been working in the field of democratization to prevent conflicts, creating those pull factors and getting governments to do the hard work that's necessary to build the inclusive societies that we need is something very difficult. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very good question. I was actually planning to take 2 more questions before I go back to the panel, but these were very long and very pertinent questions. So if anybody on the panel, if anybody in the panel would like to respond at this stage, or shall we wait and come back? Please, go ahead.
On the question whether we need a Marshall Plan, well, a kind of a long-term plan to address this that is definitely needed, you know. And I am also very, very happy to hear that in the theory of where is periphery and where is center, from you, Jagan, it would look like Europe is the center. Am I right? Which is also very nice. One of the centers, which is very nice, but also on the other hand, it puts Europe into a position where it does not completely belong. There are very many good reasons, you know, why Europe is the center, but there are limits in a way. And there I come to your question: how to make these governments actually accept what are European values, you know, and how to make this incentive, how to channelize development money through the governments. How will we secure that it works well? And of course, I can give you an example from Tunisia. Why is Tunisia having good constitution? Okay, Council of Europe has helped a little bit in this constitution, but it didn't come from, I don't know, Deus ex machina coming and giving them constitution. Because if that would be the case, we would have the same good constitution in Morocco or maybe even Egypt or somewhere else. So there is something. What is it? I'll give you an example of our attempts to work with these countries, you know, Morocco and the others, about a simple notion, at least for Europe, as violence against women. And it doesn't go easy. We have Istanbul Convention, which has very clear standards, you know, and it doesn't go easy. So you have to start with somewhere, and there I could also just draw 3 points. One is, where do we start? Yes, I agree with you. It has to be, beside the governments, it has to be work with non-governmental sector. Not easy either. Second is, how do we make incentives for them, for the governments to accept and control? Well, there I come to multilateralism and better coordination. And this is something that we are going to discuss during the seminar. There has to be better coordination, the way how to make the government accept this. Tunisia was willing, but they had a vivid society. They have a vivid society, non-governmental sector. Third, democracy. I am Director General for Democracy. You know, it's a long process. It's a very long process. So how to secure that there is a long breath to do that? And patience among people, because Arab Spring was a way towards it, but there was no delivery enough and no patience enough to sustain this long process. And then, of course, I'm sure that European governments are willing. We have very good examples, and I'm sorry that I actually listed what is bad, but if I say there are 120 cities in Europe ready to learn from integration, there is a goodwill. But, and there is a need to direct the money from development money. I fully agree there. I fully agree. But I don't want democracy to become a dirty word, and that many things are done in the name of democracy that actually in the end destroy the countries, or that destroy the long breath and willing. So I spoke anyway too much, but these are the 3 main things.
Thank you. No, I think I will go to the audience again before I go back to the panel. So the gentleman on my right there. Name and affiliation, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Wissam Al-Qaisi. I'm from the Embassy of Iraq here in Vienna. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the Foreign Ministry, as well as IPI and the Defense Ministry. Also, I would like to thank the panelists for their insightful and constructive comments. I would start I've been working closely with refugees, mainly Syrian refugees, in 2012, 2013, as we are hosting 250,000 in the northern region of Iraq, as well as, in the meanwhile, we had a security breach came later by ISIS, where we have faced a big numbers of IDPs. Actually, it is an addendum and not a question, just I need to throw it to the floor where we should focus our efforts, where we could find a global strategy towards to stabilize the conflicted zones is the best way out for IDPs and refugees. And I would love to highlight just a word about the vulnerable groups. I mean, most of refugees and migrants, they are in a vulnerable situation. And that will always makes them open to different kinds of violations. Where we have disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, it's a process by the United Nations to stabilize some regions. We always say about reintegration as it is the forgotten R, because sometimes what we are doing is great as an international community, but it is still considered, with my humble intervention, as temporary fixes, as we need to shift over to a parallel strategy where we will focus mostly on the socio-economic factors and mainly stability. And I would like to thank Mr. Yagan for his input when we compare it to the Second World War. I believe we don't have a Third World War yet, but we have some proxy wars, we have a lack of stability, instability due to existence of a non-state actor or sometimes economic situation. And I would like to thank you all for your comments and contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will then take a couple of other questions. I'm going now to from my perspective, the left of the hall here, and the gentleman with a hand up.
Thank you. Pierre Gentile from the International Committee of the Red Cross. I found it very interesting, the discussion, but one element that I found was missing in the presentation was the underlying fact that when we speak of migration today, and this is part of the changing factor, is that a big part of the phenomena is linked to conflict. And I think before discussing about investing in development in conflict areas, it is first and foremost about trying to do our best to have the basic rule of war, AHL, being respected. Because if we speak of the factors that drive people away today, I think big part of the factors is the conflict in urban area and protracted situation affecting service delivery to a large extent. And the difficulty that people have, even if they are not directly under attack. We heard yesterday your testimony of the barrel bomb, etc. But more than that, it's really the collapse of a lot of services in country affected by conflict that is one of the root causes. And I think that's a place where development actors will have difficulty to work today, with which government to work, with which authority to work on the long term. So I think before the Marshall Plan, there is really a need in the first place to go for a basic respect of AHL that can be enforced by many states who have directly, indirectly, a say in what is going on in many of those conflicts around the world.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question. I have to choose between the two of you now. I'll go there first, and then you will get the floor in the next round. Please, take the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Ziad Ashur from the Embassy of the Republic of Iraq in Vienna. I just want to add something that all of us, we know the reasons behind, led the refugees to flee their country. I just want to add what my friend, my colleague said, that most of the refugees, they don't want to, they are not being integrated, either because they refuse to be integrated, or they have, some difficulties in just to be, dealing with the life of standard in Europe. My question is, there are some measures taken by the European authorities just to tackle this problem, to get the people integrated? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now go back to the panel. Andreas, you've been very patiently waiting to share your views with us. You have the floor.
I just want to speak briefly about our friend over there to how can we do development in the, I mean, I speak about the Middle East and North Africa, like, again, apart from Tunisia, which has some stability and open, I worked for 4 years on civil society building in Tunisia myself, like, and I could see the willingness. But the others, I mean, creating the stability in the Middle East is a long-term plan, and I said it's a political plan. When I was working for Amnesty International, we had dialogue with the aid funders to Yemen, because I'm working on Yemen at that time, and we said, like, to give the regime a money, an amount of money or fund to do things, you have also to put conditions on giving them money. Like, you have to let us build the civil society, build the rule of law. Okay, I spoke to the Canadian authority at some point in Tunisia. I said, okay, we go and build the civil society, but give us a chance. I give an example. The EU, before the Arab Spring, the EU gave a big amount of money to the civil society in Syria via the foreign ministry. And then the foreign ministry of Assad regime agreed on giving money. The moment they left, they arrested the man, a very prominent lawyer, it's called Anwar al-Bunni, and then later they arrested Mazen Darwish, who is a very well-known case. He won the UNESCO prize, and they both spent 5 years in prison. Mazen spent 4 years he was disappeared incommunicado. So we don't give money. I mean, the United States gives $2 billion every year to Egypt, while the worst civil society condition now in the Middle East, apart from Syria has war, is in Egypt. It's absolute, fierce, brutal crackdown on the civil society movement in Egypt. It's like you have the fund, it's called foreign fund, while the regime in Egypt has £2 billion from the United States. They have been trying or put on trial activists and human rights lawyers for receiving funds from the EU. And part of my work, we are working on many cases. Many of them are inside prison. So this is a responsibility of everybody. If Europe wants really people stop coming here, we should look into better strategies how we can fund the government, if I don't want to call them regimes, and then encouragement in the Middle East doesn't work because they tried it. We have to put conditions. Australian government or EU, any government want to have communication with the authorities in the Middle East, we have to have, okay, we give you money on this basis, and we monitor. We need to do the evaluation and monitoring as well. Like giving money, the EU gave money, a prominent human rights lawyer, he spent 5 years in prison on the charge of accepting foreign fund. Like, with the EU campaigned fiercely to release Anwar al-Bunni and Mazen Darwish and his colleagues, but after he was completely destroyed and rotten for 4 years and 5 years in prison. I go back to the integration. I mean, the integration is, the integration is not a click on the computer. It's a process. It is. I spoke yesterday. The integration is a plan. It's a strategy to bring people. You don't. Some people, when I work in Britain or in Finland or other countries in Europe, they ask me, "Oh, these guys, they don't want to integrate." This is absolutely untrue. Every single refugee I met, who just was telling me, please, even in Greece, they tell me, can you bring me apps to learn German? For example, the people who were hoping to join their family or heading to Germany, or French or English. I had to provide them with apps, bring them apps to learn language. They already tried to integrate from Greece, even before they arrive in Europe, in Western Europe. So integration is really a process. It is when people come here, we need to make effort not to make them feel they are isolated. And I spoke yesterday, I finished this, I spoke yesterday, the local European government, sometimes I give advice to the authorities, we need to start organizing, supporting the grassroots, the local grassroots of civil society. Amnesty International in Austria is doing fantastic program of a human rights education in the schools here in Austria, in Vienna, Austria, and other places. We should support Amnesty, for example, and other, not only Amnesty, like little community, and we should, like so many civil society workers from Syria, escaped. So these people can create their own organizations, and we should look into supporting them and make them engage with the authorities and engage with local people. This is what leads to a proper integration, and people adapt the new country they are living in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very briefly, I think on the Marshall Plan, what I feel is, the migration issue is primarily seen as a humanitarian issue now. I think we should go beyond that. It's definitely a development issue and a political issue. So I think from that perspective, something like Marshall Plan may not be a bad idea. But I think probably one of the approaches that needs to be different, whatever we come up with now, it will have to be a very bottom-up approach. I think the Marshall Plan was put in a certain context. It was, in some way, was easier to drive down from the top. I don't think anything that we come up with will have to be much more bottom-up. And I think, when we are now, globally, the discussion around the Global Compact, hopefully by the end of next year, we'll come up with something as a global community. And I think from the Red Cross Red Crescent, we will be engaging in those Global Compact discussions. So hopefully something like Marshall Plan would come, maybe not in the same form, but something similar. I think on the question from my colleague in ICRC, absolutely 100% agree. I think in a place where we are already in the middle of the conflict, I think basic respect for the IHL is so important, and I think absolutely 100% agree on that. The issue around the integration, I think there are some very good examples, and I agree with you. I have visited a number of places, and vast majority of the people have no problem with integration, but they do need help. And from the Red Cross, I know very well in Sweden the way the Swedish Red Cross helps on the integration. I know in Switzerland the Swiss Red Cross, they work from the point of receipt. A lot of times people feel that they don't want to integrate. It's not they don't want to, they don't know how to integrate, because they come from a totally different social, political, economic environment. If you are washing clothes like this and you suddenly have to operate at this wash, they have no clue how to do it. It doesn't mean that they don't want to do it. And if you get a chance, look at how Swedish Red Cross helps with the integration. They have amazing way of doing it. And as you know, per capita in Europe, Sweden has received the largest number of migrants. Yeah. Please go ahead.
May I add something about integration, knowing by chance how much investment is done in the language policy? For example, Council of Europe has the language policy special advices for those who learn and teach languages. But I'm not going to speak about Council of Europe. I will just mention how much Norway, for example, invests in language teaching as a basis for integration. Like many have individual teachers, like many, especially children, but also adult refugees have individual teachers to teach people a language, Norwegian language. You know how much money does it cost? It's huge, really, it's huge. Try with your own child, to have a everyday individual teacher for languages. It's a lot, because it's a taxpayer's money. And it might, in the end, become a political issue, and one would understand why, But the reason why I mentioned that, and also, for example, the project that we have with Austrian Ministry of Defense and Sport about integration of migrants through sport. It's not about teaching human rights. It's just integrating them, Yeah. So it costs a lot of money. And the reason why I mentioned that is sometimes we do not appreciate enough, as a matter of fact, all of us, how much money and investment, personal investment, is actually given by both. By the refugees who want to learn the language and the receiving country that invests a lot into that for values and also for security reasons in future, because it's important that these children are integrated and do not end in the street. Sorry.
Thank you. Joseph, a quick comment?
Elizabeth wanted to say something.
Oh, so, yeah, hold on one second. Yeah. You first and then Elizabeth, okay?
Three brief comments. Bottom-up approaches have proven to be compellingly the best way to address many of these problems. However, they are being sacrificed on the altar of state stability, particularly in those areas where isms and migration and many things. And so the tendency is that if we strengthen the central state, we will keep those problems under control. So that's one challenge. Second, values. Values are very important, but we all know in foreign policy when there is a clash between values and interest, you know which ones will give up.
You shouldn't say that.
Particularly in areas or in countries where we have outsourced to that regime our own security. So values have a sustaining currency when they are consistently applied. Three, and last, I think the 2030 agenda might be an interesting approach for those difficult, hard cases, where perhaps a development approach might be less, particularly the way this global framework for cooperation has been crafted, where both citizen and states leadership is required. And so for certain countries, and I am thinking of various countries, particularly in Africa, who have resisted all kind of prescription, all kind of interstate and intrastate prescriptions. Perhaps supporting them in the full implementation of the 2030 agenda might be one way of approaching it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth.
Thank you. I just wanted to say one word on integration in Austria, since the question of integration in general has been asked, and Sweden and Norway have been mentioned. This afternoon, in the last session, you will get as a chairperson the Austrian director on integration measures. The foreign ministry also happens to be the Ministry for Integration at the moment, and she will be able to tell you about what the government is doing, and that is actually quite a lot, including spending a lot of money on different groups of migrants. People are entitled to language classes. They're also entitled to what they call value classes. You might call that something different, but the idea is to make people understand how our society works in order to make it easier for them to step in. And she will probably be able to give you all the details. One thing I understood is that it's easier to integrate somebody who has already had some education at home, even if it were in a completely different culture, than to integrate somebody who has never been to school. And we have experience with all these groups of societies here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we then go into the last and very quick round of questions. Do I see any hands now, or? Yes, there is one there. Please. There is. Okay, but then I will have to close my list, so it's 3 left. Okay, you go first.
My name is Franz Löw from MSF. It was mentioned at the very beginning, it's migration is here to stay. We need long-term thinking, a long breath. So how do we build the bridge to short-term political realism? We do see in the different member states. You know, we as society, as individuals, you know, where, I don't know, it felt throughout the last 2 years that it's a race to the bottom, where decent human reception was actually perceived and communicated by governments, by politicians as pull factor, you know? this race to the bottom where we go away from those values and those values being treated off to political interests. And we see it that on political realism, this subject is still centered only, I would like to say, on securitization. And you know, we won't get away with that, and I would just wonder how we can make this bridge from this long-term perspective to political realism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that you were very condensed in what you say, and I hope that will inspire the next questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Chrysoula Aliferi. I'm the Greek ambassador to Vienna. And really, I was delighted to listen time and again, even today, that migration is at the basement of culture and cultural exchanges over the centuries. We will never stop migration. Thing is, what do we do if we have problems like the ones we have right now? So, at least coming from Greece, at the bridge and crossroad of civilizations over the years, and now for more than 30 years, member of the European Union, we are the first country of the European Union to be crossed and to be reached by people who want to come. We try our best for regional cooperation. We try trilateral, multilateral cooperations with all the states in the region. We try our best with the people who arrive to us. We know about it. We used to have migrants for centuries, for more than a century. We have communities all over the world that left Greece for many reasons of the world, and we had also refugees from the beginning of 20th century, so we know what it is about. Number two, a person at sea, first you save, then you ask questions. I can ask a person at sea, who's behind you? Is it a bad guy or you are the bad guy? So we have to save those persons. And the third, which is the question, are there any right messages that we should, as center to periphery or whatever, I'm not eager to name it. Are the right messages to send to those people, and I don't mean the people who are at really areas where war is staged. The go-between. We have many countries in Africa, in Asia. Are there any correct messages to send back that please don't do it, we'll come to you? Because if they are already crossing the sea, it might be a little bit late. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think the lady beside you, did I see two hands there? No, I didn't. Okay. Yes. Then else, please. And you will then be the last speaker, so you are lucky. Okay? Famous last words.
Not speaker, just asking two small questions. We've spoken about several of you have alluded to the role of cities, of communities, of local actors, and the importance of working with them. And I just wanted to ask if there were specific concrete examples you've had on how you don't see those actors only as implementing and relying on them in making happen the policies that are decided at international or regional or national level, but how can we also involve them in designing those policies and decision making, which would only be fair, but probably also most effective, that the people who have to do it, the people who are on the front line, have a say in how we design policies and make decisions. And a bit related to that, because of course if you broaden the discussion, I wanted to, a little bit around the conditioning of aid and the role of values and principles in that. How much openness is there or should there be in various interpretations of some? I think there's very common humankind core values and principles, but there might be different interpretations of them if we talk about concrete implementations, including with regards to institutional building. So how much openness should there be in order also to avoid that people perceive and reject because a model is imposed? Thank you.
Thank you. Then in a nutshell, and I will start with you, and I emphasize to all of you in a nutshell, because we're already half a minute overtime on my watch at least. You have the floor.
Concrete examples about values. Council of Europe is a member state of 47 European countries. And there are so many documents where the values are stated. And this is a consensus of not 10 universities or 15 or whatever. This is a consensus of 47 member states that, let's say, freedom of expression is this, violence against women is this, democratic governance is this. So there is no space for interpretation. It's there, at least for Europe. That's one thing. The second thing I wanted to say about the cities. Very good examples. How can you do that? We have 120 cities, and some of them, like say, okay, where are the migrant enterprises in our Chamber of Commerce? Are they listed or not? This is very simple. So if they are listed, they are better fit in. And then what can they do, the cities? They have a procurement policy that favors sometimes migrant enterprises, because procurement is a very difficult issue. You have to be very transparent because you procure with the taxpayers' money. So how can we make the procurement laws more migrant-friendly, migrant small enterprises friendly? This is not easy, but it's possible. So we do it. Finally, about the master plan, bottom-up or not. Again, Agenda 2030 is there. Even in Europe, we have many things that actually divide us. But there is something that is really uniting even Europe there. It's Agenda 2030. So why don't we implement it? And how to bridge it? By indicators. We developed indicators, for example, in education. Council of Europe did it, together with UNESCO. You did it? You did something? This is an indicator of progress. So either you did it or you didn't. And then that's how you bridge it and make some countries do this faster. That's what I believe.
Thank you very much. In a nutshell.
Thank you. I just want to say again what I said, that we should look into instead of closing doors of what is happening and consider the refugees are invading us here in Europe, just to deal with the roots, why they are leaving. This is first, and the second and last, and I want to say the cities, like the Norwegians are fantastic. There is a group in Norway called International Cities of Refuge, which is it's called ICON, and the Norwegian is focused on giving writers and journalists asylum in Norway and other cities. Barcelona is one of them. We send, like the cities, the council receive a persecuted writer and support them to write and settle. And this is Norway leading force in that, and we can take it as an example. How can people be protected without us to cross the Mediterranean to Lesbos? Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
I will just quote two sentences from the introduction paper you sent from the IPI, just to close. To effectively deal with the challenges and seize the opportunities that arise out of large movements of people on the move, there is a clear need to involve and empower the people themselves. Yeah. The multilateral decision-making and policy discussions are often too far removed from the people they are concerned with and from the places where these decisions and policies need to be implemented. For me, this summarizes the approach we need to take moving forward, and well done, IPI, for this quick summary.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it very much. Yusuf?
I come from Tunisia, which was for a long time was a state without citizens, where we felt that governance is the hallmark or the sole preserve of the central government. And it took what it took, as you are aware, and now we are hoping by devolution of power to the local level, create a different partnership between the state and the citizen. So part of the answer lies in civic education. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. May I, before we close, thank the panelists. I think you've been great. And I feel that everybody shares my views. So can you please join me in thanking the wonderful panelists?